The Flaxborough Literary Society's annual book fair was never meant to be exciting. Its tradition was as solid and predictable as the stone steps of the town hall. Polite speeches, tables of dusty books donated by citizens too embarrassed to burn them, and the satisfied bustle of local worthies congratulating one another on being patrons of culture. Yet this year's fair opened not with a speech, but with a scandal. The audience had assembled, programs rustling, to hear Mrs. Ormerod, Flaxborough's formidable librarian, deliver her remarks. For 3 decades, she had ruled over the library with an air both matronly and tyrannical. Her punctuality was as legendary as her disapproval. But on this evening, when the clock struck 6 and the mayor signaled for silence, the dais stood empty. Her handbag rested by the lectern, its clasp undone. Her spectacles, folded neatly, lay on top. But the librarian herself had vanished. A murmur grew. The mayor chuckled uneasily. Our dear Mrs. Ormerod will be along in a moment, no doubt. But the reassurance withered. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The empty lectern became unbearable. It was as if the church organ had fallen silent mid-hymn. When a boy from the junior school stumbled into the anteroom to fetch his coat and returned white-faced, announcing that Mrs. Ormerod's shawl had been found crumpled by the side door, the room erupted in whispers that buzzed like hornets. The gossip was instant, contradictory, and merciless. "She's eloped," declared the ironmonger Creek with relish. "Run off with that traveling salesman who comes twice a year." "Abducted," cried Mrs. Durdle. "I saw 2 strangers outside earlier, loitering by the railings." "Carried off by the Lord himself," muttered the church verger, eyes wide, "for overcharging on fines." "Nonsense," scoffed Mrs. Dulap, whose envy of the librarian was thinly veiled. "She's hiding in the stacks. Loves a drama, that one." "She was never reliable," said Councillor Peebles grimly. "This is an embarrassment to the borough." "A scandal," intoned Alderman Teal, tugging at his wig. "An absolute scandal." By the time Inspector Purbright arrived, called hastily from his office, the book fair had ceased to be a civic celebration and turned into a restless mob of speculation. Sergeant Love followed close behind, already perspiring, notebook at the ready. The inspector's mild gaze moved across the room, not resting on the shawl or handbag at first, but on the lectern itself. He stepped forward, bent, and ran a finger across its polished wood. When he straightened, there was ink upon his fingertip. "Strange," he said softly. "A thumbprint, dragged sideways. And look, the index cards from her speech. 9 remain, though the set is numbered. 1 is missing." Love leaned over, frowning. "She dropped it, or someone removed it," Perbrite replied gently. "A missing word may sometimes speak louder than all the rest." The hall quieted uneasily, ears straining for each word. The inspector glanced into the handbag. A purse, a comb, a bottle of smelling salts. All ordinary. Yet the absence of the 10th card was extraordinary. He placed the bag back upon the table and turned his gaze toward the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice mild but steady, "a woman does not fold her spectacles and leave her handbag before vanishing into thin air. Nor does she mislay a shawl by a door she never took. We must ask not only where she has gone, but why someone wished her gone." A shudder passed through the audience. Love, eager to assert progress, questioned the ushers. One admitted he had been distracted by a crying child. Another thought he saw a green shawl slip through the side door, but could not swear it was Mrs. Ormerod. No one had noticed her departure clearly, yet her absence was as solid as brick. The mayor wrung his hands, whispering about humiliation before the county press. "Inspector, this must be handled discreetly. We cannot have headlines about vanishing librarians." But already a constable entered, holding out a folded slip of paper. "Found by the door, sir." Perbrite opened it carefully. It was a torn page from the library's own ledger. Across it, scrawled in hurried ink, were the words, "She knows too much." The collective gasp was louder than any hymn. Mrs. Dulap clutched her neighbor and whispered that it proved abduction. Creek barked that she must have stumbled on corruption in the council records. Peebles stammered about slander. Pike muttered darkly that librarians often knew more than was safe. The verger muttered prayers. The hall dissolved into noise. Perbrite read the message again, then slipped the paper into his pocket. His voice, when he spoke, was calm enough to cut through the uproar. "We have mislaid not only a librarian, but a chapter of truth. One card missing from her speech, one page torn from the ledger. Words denied to us are often the ones we most need. The question, Sergeant, is not where Mrs. Ormerod has gone, but what she was about to say when she disappeared." Love scribbled furiously, his face pale. The audience fell into uneasy silence. For the first time, they understood the disappearance was not a whim nor a fainting fit, but a matter of intent. Mrs. Ormerod had not simply been absent. She had been silenced. More in the next chapter. But first, what's your theory? Was Mrs. Ormerod betrayed from within her circle? Did the missing card conceal the name of someone powerful? Or was the note planted to lead us astray? Comment below. The paper, with its blunt warning, "She knows too much," still lay heavy in the minds of everyone as Inspector Purbright motioned for the handbag, shawl, and spectacles to remain untouched upon the table. The crowd had grown quieter, but the quiet was the nervous kind, full of darting, glances, and half-swallowed remarks. For Flaxborough, the sudden absence of Mrs. Ormerod was more disturbing than a corpse might have been. The librarian was not a woman who disappeared. She was a fixture, like the shelves themselves. If she could be removed, then nothing was safe. Perbrite asked the ushers again, but their accounts were full of gaps. One admitted he had stepped outside for a cigarette. Another confessed she had been busy reorganizing chairs while a boy was sick on the floor. No one, it seemed, had been watching closely at the very moment their watchfulness was most required. The inspector's eyes moved gently from one to the other, but he made no comment. He turned instead to Sergeant Love. "We must work backwards, Sergeant. Let us hear what each guest saw in the quarter hour before her absence. One lie among them may speak louder than all their truths." Love began his circuit of the hall, notebook ready. Mrs. Dulap repeated her earlier claim that she had spoken to Mrs. Ormerod about the gardening manuals and received a scornful reply. Her certainty grew as she repeated it, and she added a detail about the librarian's purse being in her hand. Creek said he saw her at the rare books table, fussing about labels. Pike swore he only exchanged a few words in passing. Councillor Peebles claimed he never saw her after arriving, though his voice trembled when pressed for where exactly he had stood. Alderman Teal became indignant, declaring it offensive to suggest he would notice the movements of a mere librarian. Each gave something, each shaded it differently. Love's pencil scratched rapidly. Perbrite watched, expression calm. He noted how Dulap's scorn was too neatly polished, how Peebles sweated with every denial, how Teal grew pompous as though volume could substitute for certainty. He leaned once toward Love and murmured, "The guilty often dress their stories with either too much finery or none at all. Modesty, you'll find, is rare in deception." Love nodded, though his brow furrowed with confusion. To him, everyone looked equally suspicious. Then a small drama unfolded. A schoolgirl, pale and nervous, tugged at her teacher's sleeve and whispered. After some hesitation, the teacher stepped forward. "Inspector, my pupil says she saw Mrs. Ormerod near the side corridor. She thought it strange that the librarian was speaking not to an adult, but to one of the waiters." The hall stirred. One of the lads hired to carry trays of buns and lemonade was brought forward, his hands still sticky from service. He shifted from foot to foot, eyes downcast. "I didn't mean anything by it, sir. She asked me to fetch a candle, saying she needed light where she was going. I thought it odd, but she spoke sharply, so I went. When I came back with the candle, she wasn't there no more. The revelation jolted the assembly. Mrs. Durdle gasped. Creek muttered that this proved she had gone willingly. Dulap sniffed and said it was staged. Peebles mopped his brow furiously. Teal swore the boy was mistaken, but Purbright's interest sharpened. A candle, he repeated softly. And for where the shelves are darkest, perhaps. How convenient that her needs were so swiftly met. He turned his mild eyes on the boy. "Did you see anyone near her?" The waiter shook his head. "No, sir, just her. She had her shawl over her arm then. I left her there." Perbrite inclined his head. "Thank you. That will be noted." The boy looked relieved to escape. Love leaned close. "So she did go toward the archive, sir. The note in the book wasn't false." "Not false, Sergeant," Perbrite murmured, "but not the whole truth either." A stir at the door interrupted them. Constable Trimble entered, holding another object wrapped in a handkerchief. "Found this under one of the tables, sir. Thought it might matter." He revealed a library ticket, its corners bent, the ink smudged as though handled roughly. It bore a single name, J. Pike. The landlord flushed scarlet. "That's mine? Mislaid it weeks ago. Means nothing. Ormerod's been nagging me about overdue books for months. She probably dropped it herself to spite me." The crowd seized upon the discovery with glee. Murmurs of "Pike's to blame" and "he had reason" rippled through. Mrs. Dulap pursed her lips in triumph. Creek grunted, satisfied to see suspicion move elsewhere. Pike sputtered, swearing he had been nowhere near the corridor, that the librarian must have planted it. His words fell heavy and unconvincing. Perbrite watched him quietly, then lifted the ticket to the light. "Curious. The ink is blurred, yet not with age. I would say it was smudged tonight. A ticket carried recently, not weeks ago. But by whom?" His eyes swept the crowd, resting briefly on Pike before moving away again. The landlord sagged, trapped between denial and indignation. Love scribbled eagerly. "We've got motive, Sir Tenno. He owed her. She pressed him. Perhaps he silenced her." "Perhaps," Perbrite murmured. "Or perhaps the ticket was placed for us to find, Sergeant. One must ask not only who gains from her silence, but who gains from his disgrace." The tension in the hall was nearly unbearable now. Guests clutched their programs like talismans. The mayor groaned about the scandal. Peebles dabbed at his forehead. Teal muttered that he would not stand another minute of these accusations. The verger whispered that the devil lurked in every shadow. Each face betrayed some fear, some calculation. Each word only deepened the tangle. Purbright set the ticket carefully beside the handbag and the torn ledger page. He looked again at the lectern, at the missing card, and at the ink smear on the wood. Then he turned back to the company, his voice mild but certain. "This evening's fair was meant to celebrate words, yet it has become a matter of what has been withheld. A missing card, a torn page, a vanished woman. Silence speaks, ladies and gentlemen, and tonight it shouts." The hush that followed was deeper than before. Even the journalists outside seemed to fade. The guests looked at one another, each seeing guilt in the other's face. Somewhere in that silence, Inspector Purbright knew, lay the shape of the truth. But for now, it was hidden as carefully as a book in the darkest corner of the archive. Inspector Perbrite lingered by the table where the evidence lay. Shawl, spectacles, handbag, the torn ledger slip, and now Pike's smudged library ticket, while the hum of the guests swelled and ebbed like restless surf. The faces before him were pale, flushed or defiant, but all carried a film of unease. In the hall that had been prepared for a polite celebration of books, the air now tasted of fear. Sergeant Love shifted anxiously from foot to foot, waiting for instructions. "We must look beyond the objects," Perbrite said softly, his gaze still on the table. Objects speak, but they rarely tell the whole tale. It is the people around them who give them voice. His eyes traveled across the hall until they settled on Pike, whose color was still high. "Mr. Pike, you will forgive the town for thinking this ticket a convenient clue. Do you have anything further to say?" The landlord's fists clenched. "Only that I was never near the side door, Inspector. I've been behind my stall the whole time, and plenty here can say so." A murmur of half-hearted support came from a few neighbors, but it lacked conviction. Perbrite merely inclined his head, not pressing the point. Instead, he turned to the mayor. "Mr. Mayor, might I trouble you to provide us with a list of who donated which books? It may be dull work, but dullness sometimes shelters what others would rather conceal." The mayor, looking as though he had been asked to surrender his last shred of dignity, mumbled agreement. He shuffled off toward a clerk. The assembly resumed its murmuring. Mrs. Dulap whispered loudly that Pike's guilt was obvious. Creek growled that the librarian had been on the trail of some scandal in the council. Peebles protested that any suggestion of corruption was outrageous. Teal muttered about the indignity of it all. Each word only deepened suspicion, and suspicion, once planted, bloomed quickly. Love drew close and whispered, "It's all slipping into chaos, sir." "Shall I get the constables to separate them?" Perbrite shook his head. "Not yet, Sergeant. Let them speak. A crowd at liberty often reveals more than individuals under guard." The inspector's attention was drawn by the usher boy who had fetched the candle. He still lingered by the doorway, looking pale. Perbrite beckoned him. "Tell us again. Where were you meant to take the candle?" The boy swallowed. "She just said, 'Bring it to me where the shelves are darkest.' That's all. She didn't wait. She was in a hurry, as if someone was expecting her." "Did she seem frightened?" Perbrite asked gently. "No, sir. Cross, maybe. Or determined, like she knew she had to do it quickly." The boy was dismissed. Perbrite looked thoughtful. "Determined," he repeated softly, as though tasting the word, and the missing card bore words of revelation. "Yes, determined fits." The guests stirred restlessly at this. Some muttered that the librarian had meant to disgrace the council. Others whispered that she had known of personal scandals. One or two speculated she had been mad. The tension built until Mrs. Dulap, unable to contain herself, declared loudly, "I heard she kept her own secret book, a ledger of indiscretions, who borrowed what, who lingered in the back rooms, who failed to return things. If she meant to publish it, she would have ruined half the town." The gasp that followed was louder than any official declaration. Faces flushed crimson. Peebles began stammering that such a thing was monstrous slander. Teal's wig slipped as he protested furiously. Creek muttered darkly that he would not be surprised. Pike swore he had nothing to hide. The verger crossed himself, his lips trembling. Each denial was a confession of anxiety. Perbrite's voice, mild as ever, cut through the noise. "If such a ledger exists, it would explain much. Fear of exposure is a sharper weapon than fear of crime. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, rumors often tell us more about the speaker than about the accused." Love scribbled rapidly, trying to keep pace. "So she had evidence, sir. She meant to speak. Someone silenced her for it." "Perhaps," Perbrite murmured, "or perhaps we are being shown what someone wishes us to see. A note, a ticket, a shawl, a rumor. Each could be truth, or each could be artifice." The mayor returned then, pale, with a list of donations. Perbrite scanned it briefly, his eyes catching on one entry, a box of miscellaneous pamphlets given anonymously. "Anonymous," he said softly. Always an interesting word. He handed the list back, pocketing the detail for later. The tension in the room thickened until it was broken by a sudden commotion at the main door. A constable entered, pushing through the crowd, and held out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Found just outside the side entrance, sir. Looks to have been dropped." Perbrite unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay a slim notebook, its cover plain but its pages filled with neat handwriting. It was indeed a ledger, names, titles, dates, brief notes of character. The guests craned forward, gasping as they recognized their own names and neighbors. Mr. Peebles, one line read, persistent with romantic novels, denies it if asked. Another, Mrs. Dulap, borrows sentimental verse but sneers at it publicly. And more, Creek owes fees, avoids eye contact, Pike returns books late, argues over pennies. It was a portrait of Flaxborough's petty hypocrisies. The uproar was instant and furious. Peebles shouted that it was a forgery. Dulap shrieked that it was malicious. Creek blustered that he would sue. Pike tried to laugh, but it sounded strangled. The verger declared it the devil's work. Every denial confirmed the ledger's sting. The chamber erupted in chaos. Perbrite closed the notebook gently, his expression unreadable. So perhaps Mrs. Ormerod did keep her book of secrets. Or perhaps someone kept it for her. In either case, its appearance tonight is convenient indeed. Love looked at him urgently. So this is what she was silenced for, sir? She meant to expose them all. Perbrite's gaze swept the hall, his voice soft but firm. Or perhaps someone wished us to believe so. A ledger found so easily is not always the most trustworthy. We must ask, was it her hand or another's? The room fell into uneasy mutters again. Suspicion spread in every direction. No one felt safe. Perbrite returned the notebook to its wrapping and set it beside the other objects. He folded his hands and regarded the assembly with his mild, steady gaze. Ladies and gentlemen, Flaxborough has presented us with more than one mystery tonight. We have a vanished librarian, a missing card, a torn page, a smudged ticket, and now a ledger of secrets. Each tells a story, but not necessarily the same one. Our task is to see which tale is true. The words settled like stones dropped into a pond. Ripples spread through every face, every whisper. And as the guests exchanged glances filled with dread and accusation, Perbrite's calm gaze seemed to rest on all of them at once, as if to say, which of you is hiding the chapter that matters most? More in the next chapter. But first, what's your theory? Was Mrs. Ormerod silenced because of this scandalous ledger? Did someone plant it to frame her or to protect themselves, or is the true secret hidden in the missing card no one was meant to hear? Comment below. The uproar caused by the discovery of the so-called ledger grew into something close to bedlam. Guests shouted across the hall, some demanding it be destroyed, others insisting it be authenticated, while a few attempted to edge closer for a glimpse of their neighbors' supposed entries. The mayor, red-faced, pounded the lectern in vain attempts to restore order. His pleas were swallowed by the noise. For a moment, it seemed the book fair would dissolve into a riot. Inspector Purbright, still holding the ledger neatly wrapped, simply stood with his quiet composure. His presence seemed to radiate calm into the din. After several minutes, the clamor thinned enough for his voice to be heard. "It is a curious thing," he remarked mildly, "how swiftly indignation becomes confession. One might think the mere suggestion of guilt was enough to prove it." His eyes moved slowly across the room. The remark struck home. A few guests lowered their gazes. Others pressed their lips tight, and silence spread again. Sergeant Love seized the pause. "We'll need statements there, sir. Every one of them. Best to separate the councillors first." Perbrite nodded, but his attention was caught by a movement near the dais. One of the ushers, a thin lad, was tugging anxiously at a curtain behind the platform. "Beg pardon, sir," he called, "but there's something here." At Perbrite's gesture, he pulled the curtain aside. A collective gasp rippled through the company. Behind the dais, wedged against the paneling, was a shoe, a woman's sensible black shoe, scuffed and missing its laces. Mrs. Durdle gave a shriek, clapping her hand to her mouth. Mrs. Dulap declared it proof of foul play. Creek muttered darkly that no one lost shoes unless dragged. Pike swore under his breath. Peebles stammered that it must have been planted. Teal adjusted his wig with trembling hands. The verger whispered a prayer. Suspicion leapt again, now with something tangible to cling to. Perbrite bent and lifted the shoe carefully. Her size, her style, he observed, and left behind in haste. Shoes are not discarded lightly, not by women of Mrs. Ormerod's habits. He held it in the lamplight, studying the sole. A faint smear of chalk marked it. He touched it gently with his finger, then examined the dust on the floor near the curtain. "Interesting," he murmured. "This chalk matches the kind used to mark the positions of tables before the fair. She was here after the room was set, but before the speeches began, which means her disappearance began closer to us than we imagined." Love scribbled quickly, excitement mounting. "So she was taken right from the hall, sir. Not outside, not later. Here, under everyone's noses." "Or persuaded to leave," Perbrite corrected gently. "One must not leap faster than the evidence permits." The guests were buzzing again, pointing fingers, whispering accusations. Mrs. Dulap seized the moment to say loudly that Pike had reason to silence her over debts, that Peebles feared exposure in the ledger, and that Teal's meetings with the librarian had always been suspicious. Teal roared in outrage, calling her a slanderous old busybody. Creek added fuel, swearing the council had been hiding money. The noise swelled once more. Perbrite raised the shoe high, and the sight of it silenced them. "This," he said evenly, "is not proof of guilt. It is proof of presence. She stood here, not far from you all, before she was lost. That means she trusted someone near enough to come this way with her." His eyes moved slowly across the assembly, pausing just long enough on each person to make them uneasy. "The question is, who did she trust, and why?" The silence that followed was thicker than before. Mrs. Durdle shifted uncomfortably. Peebles dabbed at his forehead. Pike swallowed hard. Even Dulap looked less certain. The shoe lay heavy, in the inspector's hand, not just leather, but a symbol. Mrs. Ormerod had been among them moments before vanishing. Her absence was no longer abstract. It was sharp, close, undeniable. Love approached him, lowering his voice. "This is tightening, sir. We've got the shawl, the spectacles, the ticket, the ledger, and now the shoe. She must be nearby, perhaps hidden in the building still." Perbrite set the shoe beside the other items. "Perhaps, Sergeant. But remember, concealment can be a kind of revelation. Whoever hid her meant us to look elsewhere." The mayor groaned again, nearly collapsing into a chair. "Inspector, for pity's sake, find her. The county paper is at the door, the town's name is in tatters, and now you show us shoes and scribbles." Perbrite's expression softened, but his words were calm as ever. "Sometimes shoes and scribbles are the only truths we are given, Mr. Mayor, and from them we may read more than from speeches." At that moment, another constable rushed in, breathless. "Sir, we've found marks by the side entrance, scuffing in the dust, like someone had struggled, and a handkerchief, torn." The guests gasped again, some pressing closer, others retreating. The constable held it up, lace-trimmed with a faint smear of lipstick. It was not Mrs. Ormerod's. Mrs. Dulap gasped, hand flying to her bosom. "That looks like mine," she cried, "but I lost it weeks ago." Creek snorted. "Or dropped it tonight, eh?" The crowd murmured with fresh suspicion. Dulap flushed crimson. "I tell you, it's nothing to do with me." Perbrite took the handkerchief, studying it calmly. "Perhaps it is nothing, or perhaps it is meant to be something. Either way, it tells us the disappearance was not a solitary act. There was another, present at the very door." The tension was unbearable now. No one felt safe from suspicion, and beneath the uproar lay the creeping certainty that Mrs. Ormerod's vanishing was no prank, no whim, but a deliberate act born of knowledge and fear. Every object found seemed to say the same thing. She had known something dangerous, and someone in this hall had made certain her words would not be heard. More in the next chapter. But first, what's your theory? Was Mrs. Ormerod lured away by someone she trusted, betrayed at the very door? Did Mrs. Dulap's handkerchief mark her guilt, or was it planted to frame her? Or does the chalk-dusted shoe point to another entirely? Comment below. The hall had grown thick with unease, a kind of muffled pressure that pressed down on every word spoken. The shoe, the handkerchief, the ledger, all of it had unsettled the gathering, but nothing had struck the company with quite the same venom as the discovery that the lace-edged square of fabric belonged, undeniably, to Mrs. Dulap. She stood in the middle of the assembly now, cheeks mottled with color, chest rising and falling as she tried to outshout the swell of voices condemning her. It was lost months ago, I tell you, weeks before Christmas at the church fete. Any of you could have picked it up then if you fancied some mischief. To say it proves I had a hand in this business. Ridiculous. Wicked. Her protestations only stirred more mutters. Creek, the ironmonger, crossed his arms and raised his voice with relish. Always envied her, didn't you? Mrs. Ormerod kept you in your place. You'd as soon see her out of the way as keep paying fines. Peebles, sweating, dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief that trembled in his fingers. The librarian once told me Mrs. Dulap made too much noise in the reading room. Oh yes, she was strict with her, strict with all of us. If Mrs. Dulap had finally had enough... Dulap turned on him, eyes blazing. Strict? Ha! And you, sir, never returned a book on time in your life. If Mrs. Ormerod had her way, she would have barred you from the place altogether. The company tittered nervously, some nodding, others recoiling. The momentary distraction didn't save her. The murmurs swelled. It fits. Jealousy, always bitter, and her handkerchief by the door. Alderman Teal adjusted his slipping wig with a shaking hand, eager to distance himself. If evidence is evidence, Inspector, then surely it is clear. This good woman has been caught out. Purbright, who had remained quiet while the storm swirled, now let his voice slip into the silence. Caught out, Alderman. Or caught up. Evidence is only as clear as those who wish it to be. One must ask, not simply what we have found, but who wished it to be found there. The remark caused a lull, but it was not relief. It was the heavy pause before a crowd returns to its certainty. Dulap raised her hands as if surrendering. I am innocent. It was planted, I swear it. Inspector, you must believe me. Sergeant Love, notebook braced against his palm, leaned close to Perbrite. It's a fair case against her, sir. She admits the handkerchief is hers, and it turns up at the very door where Mrs. Ormerod vanished. She's quarrelled with her before, hasn't she? Perbrite looked at him mildly. You're right, Sergeant. It is a fair case, perhaps a little too fair. He let his eyes drift across the room, observing faces rather than words. Teal's indignation looked more like relief. Pike's scowl seemed forced, as if concealing satisfaction. Creek all but smirked, enjoying the spectacle. Peebles' sweat flowed freely, though for what reason, no one could yet say. Only Mrs. Dulap, red-faced and trembling, seemed entirely without calculation. It is remarkable, Perbrite continued, how swiftly suspicion makes the guilty feel safer and the innocent look worse. But the tide had turned. Guests demanded action. She must be searched, cried Creek. She should be kept under guard, shouted another. It is the only way to protect the rest of us, Peebles added faintly. Even Mrs. Durdle, normally hesitant, muttered that it was best for the inspector to make an example, lest panic seize the town. The constables looked expectantly toward Purbright. The mayor, his face purple, thumped his chair arm. Yes, hold her. We cannot allow this farce to continue. The county press is baying outside. We are drowning in shame. Inspector, act. Mrs. Dulap's voice cracked with fury. "How dare you to accuse me of harming that woman? She was spiteful, yes, and pompous, but I would never." Her words dissolved into sobs of rage. Sergeant Love whispered urgently, "We need control, sir, for the sake of order, if nothing else." Perbrite regarded Mrs. Dulap with a gaze almost kindly. "Very well. Mrs. Dulap, you will accompany the constables to your home. You are not under arrest, but we ask you to remain there until this matter is clearer. No indignity will be shown you." His tone softened the blow, but the effect was the same. Dulap was surrounded by constables, her face a mask of wounded pride, and led toward the door. The whispers followed her like a shroud. As soon as the door closed behind her, a perceptible relaxation ran through the room. Shoulders straightened, breaths were let out, and for the first time in an hour, some even smiled faintly. Relief is a telling thing, Perbrite thought. It showed not that guilt had been removed, but that each person felt safer while blame rested elsewhere. Love exhaled. "That's settled then. At least for now, we've quieted them." Purbright turned to him, his voice low. "Settled, Sergeant. The moment suspicion becomes convenient, we should grow most wary of it. Ask yourself, who in this room is the happiest now that Mrs. Dulap is gone?" Love followed his gaze. Pike's hands no longer clenched. Teal's wig sat straighter on his head. Creek allowed himself the luxury of a sneer. Even Peebles looked marginally less fevered, but each relief was guilty in its own way. The inspector moved back to the table of evidence. He placed the handkerchief beside the shoe, spectacles, and shawl, a grotesque collection that told no clear story. He studied them in silence while the guests shuffled, whispering once more, testing their new freedom. Perbrite finally spoke, his tone mild as ever. "We have objects aplenty, but objects are like actors, placed upon the stage, given roles by someone. The true author remains hidden. Until we know who writes this play, we should be slow to applaud the performance." The words fell like cool rain upon the overheated assembly. Some muttered agreement, others frowned, but all were reminded that though Mrs. Dulap was gone, the mystery remained unsolved. Silence settled again, heavy and expectant. Love, notebook still in hand, muttered, "So you think it's a misdirection, sir? That someone planted all this?" Perbrite's eyes returned to the chalk smear on the shoe. "I think, Sergeant, that truth is rarely so tidy. And in Flaxborough, tidy is often the surest sign of a mess." The hall, though quieter, still throbbed with unease. Outside, the journalists clamored, their questions muffled by the heavy oak doors. Inside, suspicion was merely rearranged, not removed. And somewhere, Inspector Purbright thought, Mrs. Ormerod's silence was speaking still, waiting to be heard through the noise. The closing of the doors behind Mrs. Dulap and her escort was followed by a hush that felt as heavy as the dust in the rafters. It was not silence born of calm, but of a room that had briefly convinced itself of resolution only to realize the unease remained. The librarian was still gone, and every object on the table, shawl, spectacles, shoe, handkerchief, torn page, ledger, library ticket, was as ambiguous as before. Suspicion had shifted, not vanished. Inspector Perbrite stood a moment longer, his mild gaze steady upon the collection, before he turned back to the restless assembly. Sergeant Love leaned close, his voice pitched for the inspector's ear alone. "They're calmer now, sir. At least they'll sleep easier tonight, knowing we've got her under watch." Perbrite did not reply at once. His eyes moved over the faces before him, noting the subtle relaxations, shoulders unclenched, lips curved in faint relief, color restored to cheeks that had blanched earlier. He spoke softly. "Relief, Sergeant, is sometimes the most incriminating evidence of all. We must watch who wears it too readily." Love glanced around, frowning, but his faith in his superior was not shaken. He scrawled in his notebook, the pencil squeaking, "So you don't think she's guilty?" "I think," Purbright said, "that guilt rarely declares itself in handkerchiefs. It hides in silences, in glances, in the words people do not say." The mayor cleared his throat loudly, eager to reclaim some authority. "Well, Inspector, if that dreadful business is concluded, perhaps we might allow the fair to proceed. After all, the books remain, and it would be—" A ripple of outrage interrupted him. "Proceed!" cried Creek, eyes bulging. "With a woman vanished under our noses." Others murmured agreement. Mrs. Durdle looked close to fainting. Pike muttered that the mayor was mad. The verger intoned that the devil would not be so easily appeased. The mayor sat down heavily, defeated, tugging at his chain. It was at that moment that Constable Trimble, looking more than usually uncomfortable, approached Perbrite. Sir, there's something else." He held out a folded scrap of paper, found it tucked inside one of the hymnals on a display table, just now. Perbrite unfolded it, revealing a few lines in hurried, jagged script. "The truth lies below, where the town hides its oldest sins." The crowd pressed closer, gasping. Creek shouted, "It must mean the archive." Peebles whispered of hidden tunnels. Teal blustered that the very suggestion was absurd. Mrs. Durdle crossed herself. Pike muttered about basements best left alone. Perbrite read the words again, then folded the slip carefully. Interesting. First, a note about what she knew, then a summons to the darkest shelves. Now a message about the oldest sins. Someone is fond of paper as a weapon. He tucked it into his pocket. "And they wish us to look below." Love whispered urgently, "That means the archive again, sir." "We should search thoroughly. If she's hidden anywhere in this building." The inspector nodded once. "Yes, Sergeant. Let us return below, and this time not with half the town in tow." The constables barred the doors to the impatient crowd, leaving only Purbright, Love, Trimble, and two other men to descend the stairs into the archive. The air grew colder as they went down, lantern light bouncing from stone wall. The rows of shelves loomed once again, heavy with the town's records, deeds, minutes, parish rolls, forgotten donations. Dust stirred under their boots. Silence pressed in. Perbrite moved slowly down the central aisle, his lantern sweeping from shelf to shelf. He paused near the cabinet of council records where the smeared borrowing register had been found. "Observe, Sergeant, the dust disturbed again, but not in the same line as before. Someone has moved since we were last here." Love knelt, tracing the faint scuff marks. "Shoes, sir. More than one pair, I'd say. She was brought here again." "Or we are being led to think so," Perbrite murmured. A sudden exclamation from Trimble drew them to the far corner. There, behind a half-open cabinet door, was another object, Mrs. Ormerod's brooch, enamel and brass, glinting dully in the lamplight. Love picked it up carefully. "Her favorite, sir. She always wore it. It must have come loose in a struggle." Perbrite studied it, then looked at the cabinet. The door was not fully closed, and inside were stacked bundles of council minutes tied with ribbon. He brushed dust from the floor and found, faintly, a drag mark leading toward the far wall. His lantern illuminated a narrow door almost invisible against the stone. Its edges were worn with use. He tried the handle. It creaked open, revealing a short stair plunging into deeper darkness. The men froze. Even Love swallowed audibly. "A passage, sir. I never knew it was here." Perbright's voice was calm. "Flaxborough has many passages, Sergeant. They are as much a part of its respectability as the town hall clock. One leads forward, the other backwards. The respectable rarely say which direction they are taking." They descended slowly, the lantern throwing wild shadows. At the bottom, they found a narrow chamber, its walls lined with old crates and rusted tools. A faint smell of mildew lingered. On the floor, half hidden by a sheet of sacking, lay a book. Perbrite stooped, lifted it gently, and opened it. It was another ledger, similar to the first, but the handwriting was different. Inside were no trivial borrowings or small hypocrisies. These pages recorded payments, names, and sums, council contracts, land deals, and unexplained expenses. Some names leapt out instantly. Teal, Peebles, even the mayor. Love gasped. "She had it, sir. This is what she meant to reveal." Purbright closed the book with care, his face unreadable. "Perhaps. But let us ask why it is here, waiting for us so conveniently. Truths too easily found often serve someone else's story." They carried the ledger back up to the archive, the lantern light flickering. The others waited anxiously, their faces pale when they saw the book. Purbright set it upon the table, beside the first ledger. 2 books now, each poisonous in its own way. One mocking the town's petty failings, the other hinting at rot in its governance. Together, they painted a picture of Flaxborough that was far darker than its polished respectability allowed. The inspector looked at them steadily. "Whether these are hers or another's, they tell us this. Mrs. Ormerod did not vanish because she was tedious. She vanished because she threatened to speak." Love's pencil hovered over the page, his mouth dry. The implications were vast, dangerous. Around them, the murmurs of the crowd above reached like distant thunder. The storm was not outside. It was within the town itself. The return to the hall with the second ledger produced a silence so taut that every cough and shuffle of feet seemed to crash like thunder. The constables placed the book carefully beside the first, and for a moment the company stared at the pair of volumes as though they might at any moment spring open of their own accord and shout accusations. One held the small sins of the townsfolk, the other, darker still, suggested matters of finance and influence that reached into the borough council itself. The contrast was too neat, and for Inspector Purbright it rang with danger. The mayor was first to break the silence. He hauled himself upright, gripping the edge of the table as though it steadied him. His voice, though meant to be authoritative, cracked in places. This is a fraud. I tell you plainly, a concoction. Some malicious hand is at work to bring this town into disrepute. Inspector, you must confiscate these things and see them destroyed. Otherwise, tomorrow's paper will have us all painted as thieves and adulterers." A few guests murmured assent, but Creek's laugh was quick and cruel. "Destroyed? Why so eager, Mayor? If there's naught to hide, why fear the light? Unless, of course, your name is written in those pages." His eyes gleamed as he glanced at the councillors. Peebles mopped his forehead, his handkerchief soaked through. She was exacting, that librarian. Kept notes about everything, but to suggest, no, it is impossible. She couldn't have gathered this. These must be forged, a trick. His voice carried little conviction, and the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Mrs. Durdle muttered that the ledgers were cursed, meant to bring ruin on all present. Pike demanded loudly to know who had planted them, insisting that Ormerod could not have carried such damning books into the archive without help. Teal's wig shifted as he shouted that the very idea was scandalous. Others began to name Mrs. Dulap again, though she was no longer in the room to defend herself. Her absence had turned her into a convenient vessel for blame. Perbrite allowed the uproar to climb, watching faces more than listening to words. He noted how Teal's bluster seemed tinged with panic, how Peebles's lips kept moving as if rehearsing explanations, how Pike's noisy indignation rang hollow. The true weight of the ledgers was not in the words they contained, but in the reactions they produced. Sergeant Love, bent close with notebook ready, whispered with urgency. "It's clear, sir. She was silenced for this. These books, this was her evidence. She must have meant to reveal them, and someone powerful stopped her." Purbright's gaze rested mildly on him. Clear, Sergeant? Objects speak, yes, but they also deceive. If these were so dangerous, why not burn them? Why leave them waiting for us to find? Ask instead who benefits from their sudden appearance. Love frowned but wrote the words down. His loyalty was strong, but his instincts longed for neat solutions. Purbright, as ever, distrusted anything too neat. Before the inspector could continue, another commotion erupted. Constable Trimble hurried in, holding something cupped in both hands. "Found outside in the alley, sir. Just now. Recognized it at once." He lifted it high. It was a plain felt hat with initials stitched inside the lining, M.O. A collective gasp surged through the room. Mrs. Durdle whimpered into her shawl. Pike swore. Teal clutched his wig. Peebles slumped against a chair, grey-faced. The hat was damp, the brim streaked with something dark. Love examined it with wide eyes. "Blood, sir?" he whispered. Perbrite sniffed lightly, rubbed the smear between finger and thumb, and shook his head. "Ink. Library ink. Red from a stamp. But placed in an alley, at this moment, it tells a tale its owner may not have written." He set the hat with the other grim relics. "Each object brings not clarity, Sergeant, but performance. We are being led from scene to scene." The hall broke into clamor again. Some swore the hat proved she had been dragged through the alley. Others insisted she had left it deliberately, breadcrumbs to guide them. The mayor shouted that the press must never hear of it. Creek declared the whole council guilty. Pike railed that the entire business was a plot. Mrs. Durdle sobbed that the librarian's ghost would haunt them all. Suspicion rolled from one person to another like a tide battering the walls of the hall. Then came the sharpest shock of all. Over the din, a child's cry rang out. One of the school pupils, huddled with their teacher near the back, was pointing toward the dais. "Look, the shoe." Every head turned. The shoe, which had lain neatly among the collected evidence, now rested on its side. From within its hollow protruded a folded scrap of paper. Gasps filled the air. A constable reached it first, but handed it straight to Purbright. The inspector unfolded it slowly, holding it steady so that the ink did not smudge. The handwriting was different again, slanted and hurried. The words were few but chilling. "Not all secrets are hers alone." For a moment there was stunned silence. Then the uproar redoubled. "Accomplices!" cried one voice. "She was part of a ring!" shouted another. Creek bellowed that this proved the council itself was rotten. Peebles denied everything, his voice rising to a squeak. Teal thundered against anonymous slanders. Pike accused Creek. Creek snarled back. The mayor groaned into his chain of office. Suspicion ricocheted from wall to wall, settling on no one long enough to be caught. Perbrite read the note twice, then placed it carefully beside the ledgers. His face betrayed nothing, but his voice was grave. "This tells us what we have already sensed. Mrs. Ormerod was not alone in her knowledge. If not alone, then who else was meant to speak tonight? Who else feared silence more than speech?" The hall fell uneasy, the crowd restless but subdued. Chairs scraped, coughs echoed, but no one dared break the weight of his question. Perbrite let his gaze move slowly across the room. Each councillor shifted beneath it. Each townsfolk avoided it. He did not accuse, he merely observed. That, more than accusation, unsettled them. Sergeant Love bent to him again, whispering fiercely, "Someone slipped that note into the shoe right here, sir, right under our noses. That means they're still among us." "Indeed," Perbrite said softly, "and that is perhaps the only certainty of the night." The inspector straightened and addressed the hall with his customary mildness. "Ladies and gentlemen, what began as the absence of one woman has become the presence of many secrets. The librarian may have vanished, but her shadow has lengthened until it covers us all. The question is not only where she has gone, but whose silence she carried with her. More in the next chapter. But first, what's your theory? Was the note a warning that others were complicit, or a trap meant to throw suspicion wider? Who among these respectable faces is most desperate for us to believe Mrs. Ormerod did not stand alone? Comment below. The room felt smaller with every new revelation, as though the walls of the town hall were bowing inward under the pressure of so much fear and suspicion. The two ledgers, the hat, the shoe with its hidden message, all sat upon the dais like a grotesque display of relics, each one whispering a story, but never the same story, twice. The guests no longer looked at the evidence directly. They looked at one another, and in every face they imagined guilt. Inspector Perbrite remained calm at the center of the storm. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture one of patient watchfulness. It was in silence, after all, that people betrayed themselves most fully. Sergeant Love, however, fidgeted beside him, his notebook crammed with frenzied notes that now looked more like a jumble of anxieties than an orderly account. The inspector's gaze settled on Councillor Peebles, whose handkerchief had not left his brow since the first ledger appeared. "Councillor," Perbrite said gently, "you seem unusually distressed." "Perhaps more than the circumstances require." Peebles startled. "Distressed? Who would not be distressed at such a scandal? My name scrawled in that vile book accusing me of novels, of all things. And now the other ledger, false numbers, false accounts. I shall not endure it." "But you do endure it," Perbrite observed mildly. "Endure it with great effort. Your concern seems not with Mrs. Ormerod's safety, but with how her words may be received." The councillor blanched, mumbled something inaudible, and sank into his chair. A ripple passed through the crowd. Others shifted uneasily, reminded that the inspector's gaze might at any moment turn upon them. Perbrite let the silence draw out before addressing Alderman Teal. "And you, Alderman, your name too appears, and you protest the loudest. Loudness, in my experience, is rarely the companion of innocence." Teal's wig slipped again as he sputtered, "Are we to be condemned by scribbles on a page? Why, any child might forge such rubbish. I will not answer to it." "Not yet," Perbrite said softly, "but you will have to." Pike seized the opportunity to divert suspicion. "It's plain enough, Inspector. The librarian kept her little notes and schemes, and someone she crossed finally had enough. My guess, one of the council. She knew too much about their dealings. That's the truth of it." Creek gave a grunt. "Suits you to say so, Pike. But her ledger had you in it as well, owing fines, dodging payments. Maybe you feared she'd drag your name through the dirt again." Pike rounded on him, face red. "My dealings are my own. Nothing she wrote changes that." The mayor intervened weakly. "Gentlemen, please, this is unseemly. We should not—" But the quarrel rose louder, councillors and townsfolk alike flinging accusations in every direction. The air thickened with recrimination, each denial louder than the last. It was as though the disappearance of Mrs. Ormerod had peeled back the skin of civility and exposed a writhing nest of grievances. Friendships frayed, alliances dissolved, and every word only confirmed what Purbright already knew, that the librarian had been dangerous precisely because she noticed everything people preferred hidden. Sergeant Love scribbled furiously, his face pale. "It's breaking apart, sir. They'll be at each other's throats. Perhaps it would be best to detain more of them. Teal, Peebles, Pike." Purbright shook his head. "If we seize them now, Sergeant, we shall only be doing someone else's work. See who shouts loudest. See who stays silent. The balance tells us more than action." He moved slowly across the hall, his eyes calm, as though inspecting exhibits in a museum rather than living people in turmoil. At the back, Mrs. Durdle sat rigid, her lips moving in prayer. Near her, a young clerk shifted nervously, eyes darting to the ledgers as though he feared his name might appear. Two shopkeepers whispered together, one insisting he had seen Ormerod outside the chemist's a week ago with a satchel, the other swearing she had warned him about council fraud. Their gossip twisted into new speculation and fed the general unease. Then, in the middle of the din, a sharp noise cut through, the crash of a chair overturned. All eyes turned. Councillor Peebles stood, trembling, his face glistening with sweat. "I won't stay here to be humiliated. This is a witch hunt, nothing more. If she vanished, it was of her own choosing. She wanted to ruin us all and has gone to ground, laughing at our misery." His words echoed in the stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then Creek growled, "Running away won't help you, Peebles. If your name's in that book, you'll answer for it." Purbright, however, merely tilted his head, his eyes soft upon the councillor. "Sit down, Mr. Peebles. Running from suspicion makes it cling tighter. Better to remain and let the truth find its way to you." Peebles faltered, then sagged back into his seat, his hands trembling violently. The hall exhaled again, but unease remained thicker than ever. Love leaned close, whispering. "He looked ready to bolt, sir. Guilty, surely." "Perhaps," Perbrite replied. "Or perhaps only frightened. Fear wears the same mask, Sergeant, whether it hides guilt or innocence." The inspector returned to the table, surveying the strange collection of objects once more. He touched the brooch, the spectacles, the shawl, the hat, and the ledgers. "Pieces of a puzzle," he murmured, "but each cut by a different hand. One wonders if the puzzle was ever meant to be solved, or merely to keep us busy." His eyes rose again to the crowd. He noticed Pike's swagger softening, Teal tugging nervously at his wig, Creek watching with too much eagerness, and Mrs. Durdle refusing to look at anyone at all. Each told a story, none yet complete, and somewhere beyond them, perhaps still in the building, Mrs. Ormerod's story waited to be uncovered. The tension hung, suspended, heavy and unresolved, like the air before a storm. The tension in the hall was brittle, stretched so taut that the smallest spark might shatter it. The councillors muttered among themselves, faces pale beneath the lamps, while townsfolk huddled in anxious knots. The dais, with its grim arrangement of objects, the ledgers, spectacles, shawl, brooch, shoe, handkerchief, hat, looked less like a collection of clues and more like an altar to unease. Inspector Perbrite stood before it, as if officiating over a service that no one wished to attend. Sergeant Love shifted, his pencil scratching restlessly across paper. "It can't go on like this, sir," he whispered. "The longer we stand here, the more they turn against each other. Another outburst like Peebles, and someone will do something foolish." Perbrite gave no reply. His eyes were on the crowd, moving from one face to the next. There was a rhythm to the fear, those who spoke too loudly, those who said nothing at all, those who seemed almost hopeful when suspicion landed on another. He did not need words, their relief and dread told him more than testimony. At that moment, the hall doors burst open. A journalist, somehow slipping past the constables, strode in waving a notebook. "Council corruption exposed, librarian vanished," he cried, his voice slicing through the murmurs. "Flaxborough will make headlines before dawn." Gasps and groans followed. The mayor half collapsed into his chair, face a mask of despair. "God help us," he muttered. "The county will never forgive this." The constables dragged the intruder out, but the damage was done. The crowd had heard the words. Their private scandal was now public property. Murmurs swelled into arguments. Fear became anger. Creek shouted that the councillors had brought it upon themselves. Teal thundered that tradesmen had always resented authority. Pike accused Creek of stirring trouble. Peebles moaned about ruination. The hall threatened to dissolve into a mob. Then, suddenly, a crash silenced all. A window at the side of the hall had shattered. Shards glittered on the floor. Someone screamed. All eyes turned. In the broken frame, dangling from a cord, was a lantern, its flame still flickering, though guttering from the shock. It had been hurled from outside, tied with a slip of paper that flapped in the draught. Perbrite stepped forward and lifted it carefully. The note was scorched at one corner, but legible. Light shows what darkness hides. The inspector held it up for all to see, his calm voice carrying above the whispers. Another message, and this one meant not only for us inside, but for those watching from without. Gasps rippled. The mayor clutched his chain as though it might strangle him. Mrs. Durdle whimpered about fire from heaven. Pike muttered that someone meant to burn the hall down. Teal roared that anarchists had invaded Flaxborough. Creek seized the chance to sneer at authority's weakness. The noise was wild again, panic feeding itself. Perbrite examined the lantern, noting the soot on its base, the cord tied with practiced care. He set it beside the other items. "This is no accident," he said softly. "The performance continues. Someone is writing chapters faster than we can read them." Sergeant Love's voice shook. "So she's gone, sir. We're left with theatre, with tricks. Perhaps she's—" He stopped himself, unwilling to finish. Perbrite's gaze softened. "Do not assume endings before the tale permits, Sergeant. Theatre it may be, but theatre has authors, and one among us knows the script." The crowd murmured uneasily. Some whispered that Ormerod was still alive, playing a game of vengeance. Others swore she was dead, her body hidden, her secrets spilling out through these cruel notes. All felt the chill of unseen hands pulling strings. Then came another twist. A messenger entered hurriedly, pale with fright. "Inspector, word from the station. A woman answering the librarian's description boarded the late train. She carried a satchel. Bought a single to Brackford." The hall erupted again. "So she fled," shouted one. "She betrayed us," cried another. The mayor sagged in his chair, muttering about scandalous abandonment. Pike swore it proved her guilt. Creek bellowed that the council had driven her out. Teal roared denials. Accusations leapt like sparks from a fire. Perbrite raised a hand. "Calmly. A sighting on a platform does not mean she left us. A hat here, a brooch there, a note in a shoe. Everything we are given is too convenient. Ask instead who profits if we believe she's gone to Brackford." Love frowned. "So you think it's false, sir?" A plant. "I think," Perbrite said gently, "that the truth of this evening is not to be found in what we are shown, but in who shows it. And the one who shows most may be the one who hides most." The crowd absorbed this in uneasy silence. Each new revelation had expanded the mystery rather than contracted it. And now the question was not merely who silenced Mrs. Ormerod, but who was orchestrating this theatre of clues, leading Flaxborough deeper into chaos. More in the next chapter. But first, what's your theory? Was the shattered lantern a warning, or the mark of someone staging a grand illusion? Did Mrs. Ormerod truly flee by train, or was the sighting another performance in the drama? And who stands to gain by weaving fear through every corner of the town hall? Comment below. The echoes of the broken window lingered long after the lantern had been extinguished and placed on the dais with the rest of the evening's strange trophies. The townsfolk sat in uneasy silence, every chair creaking like a protest. Fear was no longer scattered whispers. It had hardened into something heavier, a collective sense that events had slipped beyond their control. Even those who had once scoffed now glanced at the ledgers and notes with furtive dread, as though the objects themselves might suddenly call out their names. Inspector Purbright stood quietly before them, his expression mild, hands folded. Sergeant Love shifted restlessly beside him, pencil poised as if he might keep order with mere scribbles. "It doesn't add up, sir," he muttered under his breath. "A hat outside, a lantern thrown, a train sighting, it's as if she's everywhere at once." "That," Perbrite said softly, "is the point. We are given fragments, each convincing in itself, yet together impossible. When truth appears to multiply, Sergeant, it is usually because someone wishes it divided." The inspector turned his gaze upon the crowd. Teal was fussing with his wig again, his hand trembling. Peebles stared at the floor as if the boards themselves accused him. Pike glared at Creek, who glared back with relish. Mrs. Durdle dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief that shook almost as much as her lips. Every soul in the room carried guilt, whether real or imagined. Then, without warning, the town hall's great clock struck the hour. The sound reverberated through the rafters, startling several into cries. At the final chime, a single voice rang out. She knew too much. Heads whipped around. The words had come from somewhere near the back. But when the constables moved to find the speaker, no one admitted to it. The hall buzzed with alarm. "A ghost," whispered Mrs. Durdle. Pike snarled that it was a trick. Teal declared it a provocation. The mayor simply groaned, clutching his chain. Perbrite, unflustered, raised a hand. "The voice, whether of flesh or fancy, tells us nothing new. We already suspected as much. But ask yourselves, why now? Why at the stroke of the hour? Our author likes his stagecraft." As if to confirm his words, another object was produced. A constable, searching near the vestibule, emerged with a folded page torn from a novel. The title was scrawled across the top, "The Disappearance of Lady Audley." On the margin, in hurried ink, someone had written, "Fiction teaches. Truth." The page, browned at the edges, looked carefully chosen. The crowd leaned in, appalled. "She left it!" cried one. "She's mocking us!" shouted another. "It's a hoax!" Teal roared. The noise swelled once more. Love clutched his notebook. "They'll tear each other apart, sir. The town's near collapse. We must settle on someone. Peebles, Teal, Pike, any of them. Better to have an answer than this chaos." Perbrite's gaze remained steady. "Answers are cheap, Sergeant. Truth is dear. If we accept the cheap, we will never afford the dear." He placed the page beside the ledgers and lantern, then addressed the assembly. "Each new item arrives too neatly, too suddenly. Consider a shoe, a hat, a handkerchief, a lantern, and now a page. Our vanished librarian could not scatter them from absence. No, these are offered to us. The question is not what they prove, but who arranges their discovery." The crowd shifted uneasily, their relief at blaming Dulap already fading. Creek, eager for advantage, shouted, "It's the council. They've been exposed and now plant lies to mislead us." Teal bellowed that Creek sought only to ruin them. Pike muttered that Ormerod herself was staging revenge from hiding. Mrs. Durdle moaned about Judgment Day. No agreement could be found. Every theory accused someone else. Then came the most shocking moment yet. A commotion at the doors drew all eyes. A constable entered, pale and breathless, holding a parcel. "Delivered just now, sir," he said to Purbright. "Left outside with no name." The inspector took it calmly, unwrapped the brown paper, and revealed a pair of gloves. Black, finely made, the fingers stiff as though recently damp. Inside one lay a note. Hands that held too much must be stilled. Gasps filled the hall. Some women cried out. Men swore. Teal tugged desperately at his wig. Peebles nearly fainted. Pike cursed under his breath. Creek muttered that this was proof of murder. Mrs. Durdle wailed aloud. The mayor slumped further into his chair, grey with despair. Perbrite held the gloves lightly, his expression thoughtful. "These too join our collection." But notice, no blood, no dirt, no sign of struggle. Merely symbolism. Each new token is more theatrical than the last. Whoever arranges this is not only hiding a crime, but directing a play. Love swallowed hard. "So it's not just misdirection, it's performance." Perbrite nodded. "Exactly, Sergeant. And like any performance, it requires an audience. Tonight you are both suspects and spectators." He laid the gloves with the other items. The sight of them all together was unnerving. The librarian's scattered life turned into a grotesque stage set. The guests looked on with wide eyes, each fearing the next object might bear their mark. The inspector's gaze lingered on them before he spoke again, softly but with weight. Mrs. Ormerod's voice is absent, but her silence speaks. And the louder these objects cry out, the more certain I am that someone wishes us deaf to what really matters. The crowd shifted again, whispering, glancing at neighbors, at friends, at counselors. In the tension, more than one pair of eyes darted toward the door, as if escape might still be possible. Purbright noted each glance, each twitch, storing them away like lines in a book. The town hall, once a place for order, had become a theater of accusation, and he, its most patient spectator. The night was not done with them yet. The town hall was hushed, though the air was still thick with the tremor of panic. On the dais, the collection of objects seemed to mock the crowd. Spectacles, shawl, brooch, handkerchief, shoe, hat, the 2 ledgers, the lantern, the torn page, the gloves. They formed not a chain of evidence, but a pageant, laid out as if someone had curated an exhibition of fear. The townsfolk shrank from it, whispering that it was unholy, while the councillors shifted in their seats like guilty schoolboys waiting for punishment. Inspector Perbrite stood in front of the display, calm and composed. Sergeant Love, less at ease, murmured urgently at his side. "Sir, we've collected more clues than one crime could hold, yet we're no nearer the truth. The town's half mad already. We must settle it." Perbright's gaze swept the hall, resting briefly on each face. "Yes, Sergeant, we must settle it, but not by grasping at shadows. We must look at what the shadows conceal." He lifted the first ledger, the one filled with petty transgressions, books never returned, fines unpaid, clandestine novels smuggled home under coats. This book delights in humiliation, a satire, yet Mrs. Ormerod never ridiculed her patrons. She was stern but never cruel. Someone wrote this to mock, not to record. He placed it down, then opened the second ledger, the one that listed payments and contracts, names of councillors beside sums. And this, too, is not her hand. Look carefully. The script falters, rushed, inconsistent. Mrs. Ormerod's own notes, those index cards, were neat, unwavering. If you noticed the difference, you were right. These were planted. A murmur spread through the hall. Teal blustered, denying all. Peebles dabbed his brow furiously. Pike cursed under his breath. Creeks smirked as if vindicated. Perbrite raised a hand for silence. The spectacles, shawl, brooch, and shoe, we assume they fell in a struggle. But not one shows damage. They were placed where they would be found. If you noticed the clean lenses, the unscuffed leather, the intact clasp, you were right. They were set down, not torn away. He held up the hat. Red ink on the brim. At first glance, blood, yet too theatrical. If you thought it a staged fright, you were right. Then the lantern. Thrown through a window, tied with a note, too elaborate for panic. It was a performance. He placed the gloves last. And these, proclaiming that hands that held too much must be stilled. But no sign of struggle, no dirt, no stain. Pure symbol. The crowd stirred uneasily. Mrs. Durdle crossed herself. Teal muttered angrily. Creek leaned forward eagerly. Perbright's voice cut through their disquiet. All of it, notes, objects, theatrics, was designed not to reveal a truth, but to drown it in noise. Someone silenced Mrs. Ormerod and then scattered 100 false trails, so suspicion would fall on everyone and no one. Love swallowed. Then who, sir? Who benefits from confusion? Perbright's eyes softened. Consider who had access. Councillors were hemmed in, tradesmen watched, townsfolk confined. Yet objects kept appearing. Notes slipped into shoes, papers tucked into hymnals. Only someone trusted to move freely could manage it. Gasps rippled as his gaze settled on the usher boy near the dais. The lad shrank back, pale, trembling. "I didn't mean harm," he cried. "I only carried things as he told me. Parcels, papers, even the lantern. He said it was for the inspector." "Who told you?" Purbright asked gently. The boy's eyes filled with tears. His finger shook as it pointed across the hall. Councillor Peebles sagged in his chair, handkerchief slipping from his hand. Faces turned toward him, horrified, incredulous. Perbrite spoke softly. Yes, Councillor Peebles feared her most. She knew of the contracts, the double accounts. She confronted him, and he panicked. He used the boy to scatter these objects, to turn her disappearance into theatre. Each new clue bought him time. Each false trail cast suspicion wider. But in seeking to bury her voice in noise, he only ensured we listened more closely. Peebles's lips trembled. She would not stop. Said she'd read the accounts, that she'd speak tonight. I only meant to frighten her, to keep her quiet. She struggled. I didn't mean... His voice broke into sobs. I thought if I muddied the waters, if no one could see straight, I'd be safe. Cries erupted. Shame, roared Creek. Teal shouted for justice. Pike muttered curses. Mrs. Durdle wept. The mayor sagged in relief that guilt had landed elsewhere. Constables moved in, and Peebles collapsed, no fight left in him. The usher boy sobbed into his sleeve, caught between fear and pity. Perbrite remained still, his face grave. Mrs. Ormerod was stern, but she loved truth more than comfort. She found what others ignored. And in silencing her, Councillor Peebles revealed his own guilt. If you suspected the sudden appearance of clues was too neat, you were right. Love exhaled heavily. So that's it then. All the chaos, all the noise, it was him. Yes, Sergeant, but let us not forget, silence too is a voice. Hers was silenced, but her absence spoke, loud enough to be heard through every lie. The townsfolk murmured, calmer now, though unease remained. They knew their secrets were still vulnerable, their respectability thinner than they liked to believe. The councillors whispered grimly, already imagining the scandal in tomorrow's press. The mayor sagged in his chair, wishing he could vanish with the librarian. The hall emptied slowly, footsteps echoing. Gossip began its work already, weaving fresh stories from the wreckage. Perbrite and Love remained behind, the inspector watching as the last villagers left. Love said quietly, "Do you think the town will ever forgive itself, sir?" Perbrite gave a small, wry smile. "Flaxborough does not forgive, Sergeant. It forgets, and when it forgets, it waits for someone to notice again." The collection of objects still lay on the dais, mute and strange. They had played their part. The librarian's disappearance had revealed more than her presence ever did. The town would remember, or pretend not to, but the lesson would linger, at least for those with patience to see. And so the case of the vanished librarian, with its theatre of clues and its trail of silence, came to its end.